Alright, it's time for another update and forecast on the park fire. Just like all our videos, we're going to start with the past, kind of figure out where some of the activity has been recently. Then we're going to actually look at what the fire is doing right now, some of the current conditions, and then we're going to go into the future, check out the weather forecast so we can kind of figure out what kind of conditions and fire behavior we can expect throughout the day today. So we'll just do a quick tour around the fire right here. If you want like a more in-depth tour of exactly where the perimeter is and some good Google Earth imagery, you could check out Zeke Lunder's page. I always watch his videos before I do these, and then I'll just try to provide kind of a concise summary of some of the things that I learned from him. So just looking at the fire, getting our bearings here, we got Chico down on the southwest side here. That's actually closest to where the fire started. But we've had strong southerly winds throughout the lifetime of this fire, so that's why it quickly pushed up towards the north. And we did get a nice break on Saturday. We had some cool, moist air move in overnight Friday into Saturday morning. You probably woke up and felt it. You could just feel that you could feel it in the air that the pattern had changed. So that really helped them throughout really the day Saturday, because the smoke kind of settled down over the fire, limited the heating throughout the day. And then Sunday we started to see some of that smoke clear out. I actually saw that on their report right here. It said this is from Sunday night, they wrote this. The decreased smoke today caused a warmer climate around the fire, which has led to increased fire activity that will remain through the evening hours. And then it does look like, kind of giving a spoiler on the weather forecast, it does look like we have a warm-up expected this week. And then winds, I would say, are still the main factor on this fire, because that's what has led to a lot of the growth recently, along with the dry, abundant fuels. So we got Chico down here, Paradise, Magalia. We haven't seen all that much heat on the fire in the southern portion recently. You notice where you see those yellow stars, that's going to be where you've had heat on the fire more than 24 hours ago. The red stars are going to be where you've had heat on the fire within the last 12 hours. And then you look at the southern edge, you're not seeing even yellow stars. So looks like a pretty good situation for places like Chico. I'd even go as far to say Paradise and Magalia at this point. But there are still definitely some concerns. So we can kind of look at the western edge. We did have some heat there yesterday. You see some of that red, but it sounds like they're pretty confident on the western side. I would say the best news that I've heard on this fire is what's been happening on the northern edge. So if you go back and watch, I think it was 2 forecast videos ago, this northern edge of the fire was chewing up about 4,000 to 5,000 acres per hour, and it was just quickly rushing towards Manton and then potentially Shingletown as well. And then that brief cool down and increase in moisture Saturday happened at literally the perfect time, because if we'd continued to see growth on this northern side like what we had on Friday, then I don't think there's any way that they could have stopped it before Manton and Shingletown. But luckily the weather finally started to work in our favor, and it sounds like they've made some huge progress up here. So it did go over 36, but since then they've been going direct, doing all kinds of drops on it, and it sounds like they're pretty confident about Manton at this point. And even if you look at the northern side of this fire, you're not seeing even the yellow stars up there. So we haven't seen all that much heat recently on the side of the fire that I was most worried about. So that's, I would say, one of the biggest wins that I've seen on this fire. Now, it's not all kind of rosy good news at this point. There's a lot of challenges still out there with this one. As I mentioned, there's some fuels in this area that haven't burned in decades. We could actually turn on fire history so you can see it does look like we have the Ponderosa fire up on this northern side. And you notice the fire perimeter, when it bumped into the Ponderosa, I don't know if they were maybe reusing some dozer lines there, or if that's actually just bumping right along. Whoops. Looks like it's bumping right along perhaps State Highway 36 in some places right there. And it seems like they've been able to hold it on some parts of 36, but it obviously has gone over other parts. But it does seem like we're getting some help from the Ponderosa fire in, I guess that was actually 2012 right there, where some of those fuels have cleared out. And on this map, you can actually see the difference in color, where you have all this green where you still have fuels. And then I guess after this fire, they went in and just clear cut it. So not a lot of fuels means that the fire, when it bumps into that burn scar, there's not much fuel to keep it going. So then it stops in its tracks right there. Does look like where you don't have that burn scar though, and then before you get to 36, that is where we had a lot of the heat more recently. So that's where you see some of those red stars popping up. And then all throughout this area, you notice you're not seeing any fire history. That's 2013 Panther fire. See how much that helps us? It certainly looks like some of those fuels have been cleared out, but it also looks like part of the park fire has already been able to go through that burn scar. So it must have had some fuels regrow in the last 11 years. So we'll see how much help we continue to get there. So zooming out, just so you can see kind of where we are on this fire at this point. Now we're looking at this kind of eastern shoulder that is actually the area of the fire where we have seen the most heat recently. Can zoom in here. So it's kind of creeping into our current conditions, but so you can see some of the smoke. Not as much smoke cover right now, and you can actually see those two parts of the fire where you see the most smoke coming off of it at the moment. Another way to view it is natural color fire, where that black is where the fire has been, and then I mean, we're not seeing too much heat coming off of it at the moment. It's also 11 in the morning, but this certainly looks a lot better than it did Wednesday, Thursday morning of last week. And then those two parts of the fire do look to be somewhat active right now. So matching that up with this map, let's turn off fire history, clean it up a little bit. It's most likely that shoulder right there, and then this area up here where you're seeing some of the smoke at the moment. Now the reason this area on the right is of some concern is because when we look at structures, turning those on, I guess first good news in terms of structures, the largest amount of structures are on the southern side, and that's where we've had very little activity recently. But then on this part of the fire that was the most active yesterday, those little orange boxes show that we have some heat coming off of it at more currently, and I mean, that goes along with the satellite imagery as well. What we're looking at there is Butte Meadows, and it does sound like they've now done evacuations out of there. I believe yesterday they had some spots getting close to there, so kind of looks like for the most part they've been able to hold it to the west of 32. I think there's just been a few cases where you had spots over 32 where the wind picks up a burning ember, drops it in all these dry, abundant fuels, and then I believe one of the spots got up to about 150 acres, but then they were able to put it out fairly quickly. And then one of the most interesting things that we have to think about this morning is see all of that heat right there, all those red stars, even some of the orange boxes, and you might think, oh, that's all bad news. That's an active part of the fire that's getting closer towards Butte Meadow. But keep in mind, some of that heat that we're looking at there was actually a firing operation that they did when the conditions were more favorable, where they most likely started at 32 and then I believe it just kind of backs down, and that actually clears out some of the fuels in that area. So it's almost, I believe sometimes they call it a catcher's mitt. I like that term. Where now if the fire moves in this area, as there's a good chance it's going to throughout the day today because of wind direction, which I'll show in a second, but if that fire now bumps into there, what the hope is that now all of these fuels have burnt out, then you also have 32 right there. So the fire comes up to this point, then no more fuel, it stops in its tracks. The danger there, as we've seen on a number of fires in the past, though, is that a burning ember just jumps over that and then it takes off. And then also it doesn't look like the firing operation goes all the way down and connects along 32, so there is also the chance that it would creep around there. Although maybe this perimeter is old and they were actually able to complete the firing operation and connect it all the way down here overnight. I think that'll be something interesting that we'd have to look out for when we look at the newest perimeter data. But the point I'm trying to make there is some of those stars and some of that heat that we're seing on this map could actually just be left over from that firing operation, which is actually to our benefit. So I would say that's definitely still the part of the fire where I'm expecting the most growth throughout the day today. Notice though, I'll just turn on winds right here. The wind's going to be, looks like southerly on the western side of the fire, which is good for all of these structures to the west of the fire. The last thing they would want would be an east wind, which would push the fire closer towards them. So I'm expecting, some activity on the west, but not anything that's going to threaten a lot of those structures anytime soon. Northern side, I'm feeling way more confident than I was on Friday when it was making quite a run towards Manton. Southern side, we look good down there. I mean, conditions can obviously change this time of the year, but the fact that our wind is coming from the south is just going to continue to keep that fire away from Chico, away from Paradise, away from Magalia. This shoulder, though, when you think about those southwesterly winds, you think about the fact that a lot of these fuels haven't been burnt down in decades, there's a good chance we see a large amount of growth on this side of the fire today. But it all comes down to how well that firing operation holds. Maybe we just kind of fill that in and then it stops, and then that's all that happens today. But I think that's the big question mark in the forecast. So just coming back to fill in some of the information of what's happened in the past. It is now up to 368,000 acres, 12% containment. There's a very large number of orders and warnings in place. So even though I'm saying a lot of good news throughout this forecast, definitely continue to take the evacuation orders very seriously, because as we've seen on this fire, conditions can change in a moment, and then the fire can take off 10 miles in a number of hours if those winds pick up. And it does look like we are going to have some stronger winds throughout the day today than what we have had in previous days, because we're going to have more daytime heating, also some drier air filling in as well. But with that acreage that we just updated, Park Fire is now the 6th largest California wildfire in history. Now, one interesting thing though, you look at the structures, it says 109. You could view that as bad and good news in a way. The bad news, obviously, you never want to see structures destroyed on a fire. Like, for example, out of that 368,000 acres, not all of that is actually detrimental to California. Actually, you could say the majority of that's actually beneficial, because in California, a lot of our plants and even some of our animals have evolved with fire over time, and some of them even rely on it for even just survival, reproduction. And this will clear out a lot of the fuels. It'll protect, for example, Chico from some strong northerly wind event. Now you have basically this giant fuel break that'll protect you from northerly winds that might have pushed a fire down into Chico in the past. So good for future fire that these fuels have cleared out. It's good for a lot of the plants and animals, as long as there's it's not all high severity. It's not all just completely devastated through here. We've seen videos where it just sort of creeps along the ground and then actually leaves a lot of the trees untouched. But where obviously some of the bad news comes in is when it does destroy structures or when people have to evacuate. I know that can be quite a challenge, and you think about that's just a number right there, but each one of those structures most likely has a lifetime of memories in it. So you never want to see that. But something very interesting happened with this number recently. I believe it was originally at 134, and normally on a big fire like this, and especially when you look at Cohasset in here, which is within the fire perimeter, and it looks like there's a lot of orange dots right there. Although if you zoom in, you can actually see that unburned island. That's actually the first time I've noticed that on this map. That's great to see right there. But normally on a fire like this, especially when you have an entire community within the perimeter, once they start updating the structures destroyed, every time you check it, that number continues to go up and up as they continue to assess more properties. And I think it's the first time on a fire that I've seen it where the number actually went down. So we went from 134 structures destroyed to 109 structures destroyed. So at least that is maybe the silver lining we could pull out. Although, again, it's rough to see any structures destroyed on this fire. So that kind of sums up, I think, the past. Now let's try to take a look at current conditions. Again, we do have those 2 active parts on the northeastern portion of the fire, and the reason that's important is because our winds are going to be coming from the southwest today, so that's going to try to push it towards the northeast. And if we actually just take a look at that northeastern portion of the fire to actually see what it looks like right now. So zooming in, wow, it does look like we have a decent amount of aircraft on the fire right now. That's actually one good thing about having less smoke, as we're seeing on the satellite imagery here. With less smoke, they can use aircraft a bit more, but the downside of having less smoke over the fire is we're going to be heating up more throughout the day today, which then usually leads to windier conditions. But this camera right here is going to be looking at that northeastern side of the fire that we're, I think, the most interested in at this point, and just seeing what it looks like. Yeah, so that's pretty active right there. We're not seeing those huge plumes though, where we have the big pyrocumulus that we've seen in a lot of the past days. But again, we're going to see things heat up a bit more as we get into this afternoon, and then we'll most likely see some of the fire activity pick up as well. So without further ado, let's just get into the weather forecast. Looks like today, I did the weather forecast for Manton, although, you know, we maybe actually should. So let's type in Manton. I think since I'm not as worried about Manton anymore, I think I want to pick somewhere maybe a bit more like in that drainage, because that's most likely going to be closer to where our fire activity is going to be throughout the day today. And then let's clean up these charts a little bit. I think this will be a more accurate forecast than that first one I was going to pull up for where most of our fire growth is going to be today. So temperatures around 85 to 90 degrees, so warmer than we have been the last couple of days. And it looks like that warm up is going to continue throughout this entire week as a ridge starts to build over us. What can happen when a ridge builds over you, though, is that the winds decrease. So it's kind of a mixed bag. There's 2 sides of that coin. It gets hotter and drier, but it also usually means the winds calm down. Your windiest conditions are usually as your ridge, or where a lot of the heat is exiting the area. That's what we saw last Thursday and Friday. So it looks like it's hotter today. Looks like it is going to be drier today, but relative humidity around 20-22%. It's not bad. Or it's maybe it's not as bad as the 10 to 15% we were seeing last week. I'll put it that way. And then tomorrow it looks like temperatures slightly warmer, and then very similar relative humidity. So warmer, drier than the last couple of days. That would mean more fire activity throughout the day today. But what we've seen on this fire routinely is that wind has been the biggest factor. That's why it was able to take off. I haven't measured it recently. Distance from the tail to the tip. That is 42.8 miles, and most of that happened in about 2 or 3 days. And then we actually haven't seen as much growth over the last 2 days. And a large part of that was that consistent southerly wind that we had. So looking at our winds this afternoon, this is showing that the winds are going to pick up to have some gusts over 20-25 miles per hour. And the direction does look like it's coming from the southwest. So I usually don't go with the wind forecast on this chart. It seems to always kind of downplay how much wind we're expecting. This one, it does tend to be pretty good with direction though. So it shows southwesterly today, but even a bit more westerly in the wind tomorrow. So, but also slightly less wind tomorrow. If we fast forward on this one, where I trust windy.com a bit more with the wind numbers, it looks like tomorrow afternoon, still some gusts over 20, but it looks like it's not as widespread over the fire. For example, if you click into the middle of the fire, that'd be maybe some 15 to 20 mile per hour winds. So just kind of summarizing, I think this summarizes it best. It says tomorrow, but this is from last night, so it's talking about today. Winds and temperatures will increase slightly, and humidity values are expected to drop. Smoke coverage in the morning will limit fire activity, but will thin across the fire earlier. That's something that we're seeing right now, and allow for increased activity with the changing weather. Spotting and torching will continue to challenge control lines. So the summary there is that we're in a much better position than we were last Thursday and Friday, especially around Chico, Paradise, Magalia. Oh, and I didn't mention Forest Ranch. I'm glad I just remembered that. I'm sure anybody watching on the live stream was just waiting for me to talk about that. So Forest Ranch down here, I believe they had plans to change it from an evacuation order to an evacuation warning yesterday, but then they actually did get some spotting, some maybe flare-ups around this area, so they kept it as an evacuation order. But the fact that most of our heat has been well to the north of Forest Ranch, and our winds are going to be from the southwest, which is just going to continue to try to push the fire away from Forest Ranch, I'm not too concerned about that area. But again, like we saw yesterday, a few little hot spots happen, things start to flare up. That can happen as conditions get hotter and drier, as well as areas that we thought were out can actually kind of flare back up again. So I definitely have increased confidence down there, but still keeping an eye on it for sure. Just to summarize though, where I expect most of the growth to be today is going to be on this northeastern section of the fire. I think the question mark though is just how well that firing operation that they did holds up, if it's able to catch a lot of that activity, or if it does kind of spot over it and then start to take off into these fuels that haven't been burnt out in decades. For that, we're just going to have to wait and see. I think one other kind of silver lining that can be kind of a good note to end on is the fact that we now have over 4,500 personnel on this fire, 33 helicopters, over 400 engines. Those are some of the largest numbers I've ever seen on a fire, and they're just working tirelessly to make sure that this fire doesn't get out of control again. But again, very challenging conditions that they're dealing with out there, so we're just gonna have to kind of stay updated. I'll do my best to share what information I can find with you, and hopefully this video was helpful. Thoughts and prayers to everybody who's been impacted by this fire, and thanks for watching.